Every building in the 1800s had a spire, a copper dome, or a metal antenna on top, and official architecture claims these were just decorations. But Nikola Tesla's groundbreaking wireless energy system was already built into cities 200 years before he was even born. In this video, I'll show you the suppressed engineering blueprints hidden in plain sight, the real reason entire cities burned down in the late 1800s, and why they erased an entire empire from history books in the 1920s. I've spent 3 years analyzing original photographs, construction patents, and deleted scientific papers that prove this technology existed and was deliberately destroyed. You're about to see 8 pieces of evidence that will completely rewrite what you thought you knew about free energy, the global reset, and who's still using this system today. Don't click away, because by the end, you'll never look at old buildings the same way again. Look at any photograph of an American or European city from the 1860s through the 1890s. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Petersburg, Paris. Every single prominent building, and I mean every single one, features elaborate metallic structures on its roof. Spires reaching into the sky, copper domes oxidized to that distinctive green patina, ornate metal finials, arrays of what architectural records call decorative elements. The official explanation? Pure aesthetics, beauty for beauty's sake, the Victorian love of ornamentation taken to its logical extreme. But here's what stopped me cold when I first started digging into this. Modern architects can't actually explain the engineering purpose of these structures. I contacted 5 architectural historians specializing in 19th century construction. I asked a simple question. Why did builders invest enormous resources? We're talking thousands of pounds of copper, gold leaf, specialized metalwork on roof ornaments that served no structural purpose. 3 of them gave me variations of that's just how they built back then. One admitted he'd never really thought about it. The 5th said something that stuck with me. The budget allocations for these roof elements in construction records are oddly disproportionate. Sometimes they exceeded the cost of the building's foundation. Think about that. More money for the decoration on top than for the structural base holding up the entire building. I started looking at construction invoices from the 1870s. The Philadelphia City Hall, completed in 1871, spent $47,000 on its tower's metallic elements. In today's money, that's roughly $1.2 million. For comparison, the entire marble facade cost $31,000. Why? And here's where it gets strange. If you compare photographs of the same buildings taken before and after the early 1900s, something's missing. The spires are shorter. The copper elements are gone. The elaborate metal networks that once crowned these structures have been systematically removed. The Boston Custom House had a massive copper dome installed in 1847. By 1923, it's topped with a completely different structure, simpler, with minimal metal. The official record states modernization. But why modernize something that's purely decorative? If it served no function, why bother changing it at all? I started to wonder, what if we've been looking at this backwards? What if these weren't decorations at all, but the entire point of the building? Now, before you click away thinking this is going to be another wild conspiracy theory, I need you to stay with me for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to show you comes from official patent records, published scientific papers, and documented construction techniques that anyone can verify. And if you want to see where this rabbit hole leads, because it goes much deeper than even I expected, hit that subscribe button now, because next week I'm releasing evidence about what's actually underneath these buildings and why modern construction crews are specifically forbidden from accessing those spaces. The first real crack in the official story came from a place I didn't expect: Nikola Tesla's own notebooks. In 1891, Nikola Tesla publicly demonstrated wireless power transmission at Columbia College in New York. He lit phosphorescent bulbs without any wires, transmitted electricity through the air, and proposed a world system of wireless energy that would make power lines obsolete. The scientific community hailed it as revolutionary, groundbreaking, the future of electricity. But here's what the textbooks don't mention. Tesla wasn't the first person to propose this. He wasn't even the first to demonstrate it. In 1826, 65 years before Tesla's demonstration, a British inventor named William Sturgeon presented a paper to the British Association for the Advancement of Science describing atmospheric electrical collection using elevated metallic conductors. His designs included detailed diagrams of church spires modified with copper wiring and what he called collection spheres at various heights. The paper was published in the Philosophical Magazine. It's still available in archive, though you have to specifically request it. It's not digitized like most of the scientific literature from that period. Sturgeon's work cited even earlier experiments. A Frenchman named Jacques de Romas had in 1753 used church spires in the town of Nerac to collect atmospheric electricity. His notebooks, preserved in the Nerac Municipal Archives, describe a network of 7 church buildings, each with modified spires, that he claimed could draw and store the electrical fire in sufficient quantity for practical illumination. Now, mainstream science dismisses these accounts as primitive experiments that didn't lead anywhere, dead ends in the historical record. But I found something that made me question that narrative. In 1867, the British Patent Office granted patent number 2741 to an engineer named Samuel Alfred Varley. The patent was titled Improvements in Magnetoelectric and Electromagnetic Apparatus. Buried in the technical specifications is a design for what Varley calls a distributed aerial collection system utilizing existing architectural structures as primary receivers. The diagrams show churches, specifically churches with spires. The patent describes using the building's spire as an antenna, running conductors down through the structure, and using what Varley calls the natural resonant cavity of the church interior to amplify and regulate the collected charge. The patent was granted, it was published, and then nothing. No record of it being built, no follow-up patents. Varley himself published extensively on electrical engineering. He's credited with improving the dynamo and contributing to early telegraph systems, but this particular patent just vanishes from his documented work. I reached out to the Institution of Engineering and Technology Archives in London, which holds Varley's papers. They confirmed they have his notebooks from the 1860s. When I asked specifically about notebook entries from 1866 to 1868 covering aerial electrical collection, I was told those specific volumes are unavailable for research purposes due to preservation concerns. Interesting timing, given that every other volume from his collection is available. But here's what really made me start connecting dots. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, his famous unfinished wireless power station built in 1901 through 1902 on Long Island, wasn't actually that original in design. If you look at the architectural plans, it's essentially a massive church spire, a mushroom-shaped copper top, a central tower, an extensive underground network of tunnels described as grounding plates, and a building at the base designed according to Tesla's notes to create resonant cavity amplification. The design is nearly identical to what's already on hundreds of major buildings across America and Europe, just bigger. Tesla spent $150,000 on Wardenclyffe. J.P. Morgan, his primary investor, abruptly pulled funding in 1906. The official story is that Morgan realized there was no way to meter and profit from wireless power, so he killed the project. But what if Morgan realized something else? What if Tesla wasn't inventing anything new? He was recreating something that already existed. And what if that existing system was about to become very inconvenient for people who just invested millions in copper wiring, power plants, and metered electrical distribution? Which brings us to a question almost nobody asks.
If these spires and copper domes were already on buildings before Tesla, before Edison, before electrical power was commercialized, what were they for? The standard answer is nothing, just decoration. But I found architectural engineering manuals from the 1850s that suggest something very different. I'm holding a book that most people have never heard of. It's called The Practical Architecture of Ecclesiastical and Public Buildings by Edmund Sharp, published in 1856. Sharp was one of Britain's leading church architects. His designs are still standing across England. On page 273, there's a section titled On the Practical Necessity of Metallic Roof Elements. This is supposed to be a book about making churches beautiful, but this section reads like an electrical engineering manual. Sharp describes the essential components of a properly designed spire. The primary conductor must be of copper, with cross-sectional area proportional to the height of the structure. Connection to the finial must ensure minimal resistance. The descent through the structure should follow the load-bearing elements, with branching conductors at each level. The terminal point must reach the substrate beneath the foundation. He's describing a wire, a very large wire running from the top of the building to deep underground. The official explanation for this is lightning protection. And yes, lightning rods were a real thing. Benjamin Franklin invented them in the 1750s. But Sharp's specifications go way beyond lightning protection. For instance, he specifies that the copper conductor should connect to plates of minimum 12 square feet, buried no less than 40 feet below grade. That's not a lightning rod grounding, that's a massive electrical collection plate. He also describes what he calls the necessary interior arrangement. The nave must maintain clear vertical sight lines. Metallic elements in the roof structure should be interconnected. The flooring must be of fired clay brick or stone, never wood, to ensure proper dielectric separation from the substrate connection. Dielectric separation. That's not architectural language. That's electrical insulation terminology. But here's what made me sit up straight. Sharp specifies that windows should use minimal ferrous elements in their framework, with preference for lead cames in divided lights. He wants non-magnetic metal in the windows. Why would an architect care about the magnetic properties of window frames? Unless those windows are part of an electrical system. I started looking at actual church construction from this period. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, built from 1858 to 1778. The spires are copper over an iron framework. Official height, 330 feet. Weight of copper elements, 79 tons. 79 tons of copper. The records show that the copper was specified as high conductivity grade, minimum 98% purity. That's electrical grade copper, the same specification used for power transmission cables today. The records also show something odd. The builders installed ventilation shafts running from the basement to the roof interior, but these shafts are lined with ceramic tiles. Why would you line a ventilation shaft with ceramic? Unless you're creating an insulated pathway for something other than air. I found similar patterns in dozens of major buildings from this era. The Philadelphia City Hall, the Chicago Water Tower, the Boston Public Library, even secular government buildings and private mansions. If they had a tower or prominent spire, they had these same features. Massive copper elements, underground chambers, ceramic-lined shafts, clay brick interiors. Now, you might say, this is all just coincidence. These are standard building practices from that era. Except they weren't. I compared buildings from the same period that didn't have spires. Row houses, warehouses, ordinary commercial buildings. None of them had these features. The underground chambers were smaller, simpler. The brickwork was standard. There were no ceramic-lined shafts. These features only appeared in buildings with significant vertical metal structures on top. And here's the detail that I couldn't shake. In almost every case, these buildings had basements that extended unusually deep. The Boston Public Library's basement goes down 62 feet. That's 6 stories underground for a building that's only 5 stories above ground. The official explanation is storage, but the basement layouts don't look like storage. They look like chambers, large open spaces with vaulted brick ceilings, very similar to the cathedral interiors above them. I found a construction photograph from the Chicago Public Library taken during building in 1893. The basement is clearly visible. The walls are lined with what the caption describes as acoustic tiles. But acoustic tiles are ceramic, and they're arranged in a very specific pattern that looks more like electrical insulation than sound dampening. In the center of the basement space is a massive iron column descending from the center of the building above. The column is surrounded by a brick structure that separates it from the rest of the basement. The caption reads, "Foundation Pier Support." But the column doesn't support anything. It hangs suspended in the basement space, terminating in a large copper sphere. Why would a structural support column end in a copper sphere? Unless it's not a support column at all. Tesla described this exact configuration in his Wardenclyffe notes. The elevated terminal must connect through the resident structure to the ground terminal, which should be spherical to maximize surface area for charge distribution. He was describing buildings that already existed. But if these buildings were part of some kind of power system, where was the power coming from? There were no power plants in the 1860s, no electrical grid, no generators.
That's when I started looking into something that's been edited out of physics textbooks, the concept of ether. October 8th, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire begins. Official death toll, 300 people. Buildings destroyed, 17,450. Total damage, $200 million, roughly $4 billion in today's money. The official cause, a cow kicked over a lantern in Catherine O'Leary's barn. But here's what they don't teach in school. That same night, fires broke out in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, 250 miles north, and in Holland, Michigan, and in Manistee, Michigan, and in Port Huron, Michigan, all on the same night. The Peshtigo fire actually killed more people than Chicago, somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500, but it gets almost no attention in history books because it happened in a small lumber town. Official explanation, drought conditions and high winds caused simultaneous fires across the region. Possible? Yes, but here's what made me look closer. Of the 17,450 buildings destroyed in Chicago, a disproportionate number were the city's most prominent structures: churches, government buildings, the courthouse, the original Board of Trade building. All of them had extensive copper spires and domes. After the fire, Chicago rebuilt, but look at photographs of the new buildings versus the old. The spires are different, shorter, less copper, simpler designs. The Chicago Water Tower is one of the only structures that survived the fire. It still had its original spire until 1906, when the city replaced it with a simpler version for structural integrity. Why would you change the structural integrity of a building that had already survived a massive fire? I started looking at other major fires from this period. There are a lot of them. Boston, November 9th and 10th, 1872, destroyed 76 acres of the downtown commercial district, including many prominent buildings with spires. Official cause, a horse kicked over a lantern in a factory. Wait, another horse and lantern? Baltimore, February 7th and 8th, 1904, destroyed 140 acres of downtown, including City Hall and dozens of churches. Official cause, a cigarette in a warehouse. San Francisco, April 18th through 23rd, 1906, destroyed 28,000 buildings. Official cause, fires following an earthquake. Now, the earthquake is real, there's no question about that. But what's interesting is which buildings the fire destroyed. A study by the Army Corps of Engineers after the fire noted that brick structures with extensive metal roof elements sustained disproportionate fire damage compared to similar structures without such elements. That's a strange observation. Metal doesn't burn.
If anything, metal roof elements should have protected buildings from fire. Unless the metal made them targets. I found something in the San Francisco Chronicle archives from April 24, 1906, 6 days after the earthquake. It's a short article buried on page 11. Fire Department reports unusual electrical phenomena. The article quotes Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan's deputy describing persistent electrical discharges observed in the upper portions of burning buildings, particularly those with copper architectural elements. Electrical discharges during a fire in buildings with copper elements. The article speculates it might be related to broken power lines, but here's the thing. Most of those buildings weren't connected to the electrical grid yet. San Francisco's electrical service in 1906 was limited to the downtown core and some wealthy residential areas. Many of the churches and public buildings destroyed in the fire had gas lighting, not electricity. So where were the electrical discharges coming from? After the San Francisco fire, the city rebuilt. And just like Chicago, the new buildings had different spires. Shorter, less elaborate. In many cases, no spires at all. City Hall, rebuilt in 1915, has a copper dome, but it's much smaller than the original, and the specifications show it's purely decorative. No internal conductors, no connection to the structure below, no basement chambers. It's like they deliberately built a non-functional version. I started mapping these major fires. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. St. Louis, 1876. Baltimore, 1904. San Francisco, 1906. Toronto, 1904. Jacksonville, Florida, 1901. All within a 40-year period. All destroyed significant numbers of prominent buildings. All were followed by rebuilding programs that simplified or removed the elaborate metal roof structures. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. During the exact same period, 1870 to 1910, there's a massive expansion of commercial electrical infrastructure. Edison's first power station opens in 1882. By 1900, there are 3,662 private electric utilities operating in the United States. These companies invested enormous amounts of money in copper wiring, power plants, and metering equipment. Their business model depended on people paying for electricity. If there was already a system that provided power without payment, without meters, without infrastructure they controlled, that's a problem. I want to be very clear, I'm not saying there was a conspiracy to burn down cities. That would be an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence, and I don't have that evidence. But I am saying there's a pattern here that's never been adequately explained. And I'm saying that after these fires, something changed. The architectural features that characterized major buildings for over a century, the elaborate spires, the copper domes, the deep basements, were systematically simplified or removed. Why? If they were just decorations, why bother changing them? Decorations don't threaten anyone, unless they were never decorations at all. But to understand what they might have actually been, we need to talk about something that was removed from physics textbooks in the early 1900s, a concept called the luminiferous aether. In the 19th century, every physicist believed in the aether. This wasn't a fringe theory, it wasn't speculation. The existence of aether was considered as settled as gravity. Maxwell built his equations on it, Kelvin defended it, Hertz assumed it in his work on electromagnetic waves. The aether was simple. Space isn't empty, it's filled with an invisible medium that carries light waves and electromagnetic energy, just like air carries sound waves. Makes sense, right? Waves need something to travel through. In 1887, Michelson and Edward Morley conducted an experiment to measure the Earth's motion through the aether. They expected to find it. Instead, they found nothing. No aether wind, no drag, no detectable motion. The experiment was repeated, same results. By 1905, Einstein published special relativity, which explained physics without needing aether. The concept was abandoned. Physics moved on. That's the official story. But here's what bothers me. The Michelson-Morley experiment proved you couldn't detect aether using their specific method, interferometry. It didn't prove aether doesn't exist. It proved that if aether exists, it doesn't behave the way they expected. And there were scientists who argued exactly that. Oliver Lodge, one of Britain's leading physicists, spent decades arguing that aether existed but was entrained by matter, meaning it moved with the Earth, which is why you couldn't detect relative motion. He published paper after paper on it. He was respected, credible, and nobody could definitively prove him wrong. Nikola Tesla rejected Einstein's relativity entirely. In a 1932 interview with the New York Times, he said, "The theory of relativity is a mass of error and deceptive ideas violently opposed to the teachings of great men of science of the past and even to common sense. The aether exists, and it is the medium of transmission of waves of energy." Now, you can dismiss Tesla as eccentric, but he was also the guy who invented AC power, the radio transmission principles, and built working demonstrations of wireless power, so maybe he knew something. What's interesting is the timing. The aether was mainstream physics until about 1905. By 1920, it had almost completely removed from textbooks. Physics departments stopped teaching it. Papers questioning relativity were increasingly rejected from journals.
And during this exact same period, 1905 to 1920, those elaborate building spires were being systematically removed or simplified. Coincidence? Maybe. But consider this. If aether exists and can be tapped for energy, you'd need a large conductive surface elevated into it, like a spire. You'd need a way to channel and regulate the collected charge, like a resonant cavity interior. And you'd need a ground connection to complete the circuit, like those deep basement chambers with buried copper plates. You'd need exactly what those 19th century buildings had. Now, I can hear the objections. If this technology worked, why isn't it used today? Why would anyone suppress free energy? Fair questions. But here's a different question. What happened to all the scientists who continued researching aether-based energy after it became unfashionable? Thomas Henry Moray built a device in the 1920s that he claimed could extract power from radiant energy in the atmosphere. He demonstrated it publicly multiple times, producing enough power to light up banks of light bulbs with no visible power source. His lab was broken into in 1940 and his device was destroyed. He was shot at in 1942. He couldn't get his work published in mainstream journals. He died in 1974, his research largely forgotten. Eric Doloff, a researcher in the 1980s, replicated historical experiments on atmospheric electricity collection. He published detailed papers showing Tesla's wireless power system could work using principles consistent with an aether medium. He died suddenly in 1994 at age 42. Officially, heart attack. His lab notes and experimental equipment disappeared. Paramahansa Tewari, an Indian nuclear engineer, developed what he called a space vortex theory that brought back aether concepts to explain electromagnetic phenomena. He built generators based on these principles that he claimed had efficiency rates over unity, meaning they output more energy than they consumed. He died in 2017. His work remains on the fringes of physics, unpublished in major journals. Now, I'm not saying these people were silenced. I don't have evidence of that. But I am saying there's a pattern of researchers who pursued aether-based energy concepts, who all faced unusual resistance, and whose work has been systematically excluded from mainstream physics. And I'm saying that the suppression of aether from physics happened at exactly the time when a potentially aether-based architectural power system was being dismantled across the Western world. Which brings me to something I found in a library basement that nobody talks about. Old maps that show a completely different world. I need to show you something. This is a map from 1892, published by Johnston's Family Atlas in Edinburgh. It's a standard world map from that period. You can find it in any research library. Now look at Central Asia. There, occupying most of what we now call Kazakhstan, Western China, Mongolia, and parts of Siberia, is a territory labeled Tartary. Not the Ottoman Empire, not China, not Russia. Tartary. It's not a small notation. It's a major territorial designation, comparable in size to the entire United States. Now, before you say that's just an old name for that region, you're right. Sort of. Tartary appears on maps going back to the 1500s. It was a genuine geographical designation. Marco Polo mentioned it. Medieval chronicles reference it. It was a real place with real people. But here's what's strange. If you look at maps chronologically, Tartary doesn't shrink gradually as European knowledge improves. It disappears suddenly. Maps from 1900 still show it. By 1920, it's gone, completely. The territory is now divided between the Soviet Union, China, and Mongolia, with no reference to Tartary at all. Now, the official explanation is simple. Tartary wasn't a unified state. It was a Western term for various nomadic groups across Central Asia. As these regions were colonized by Russia and China, the old designation became obsolete. Perfectly reasonable. But then I started looking at architectural similarities. Buildings in Kazan, Russia, the historical capital of what maps called Volga Tartary, have the same spire designs as churches in Chicago. Same copper domes, same deep basements, same ceramic-lined internal shafts. Buildings in Vladivostok, on the Pacific coast of Russia, same features. Buildings in Harbin, China, built by Russian engineers in the late 19th century, same features. Buildings in San Francisco, Seattle, Philadelphia, same features. The architectural style is almost identical across continents, all built in the same narrow window, 1850 to 1890. And here's what really caught my attention. If you map the locations of these buildings, they form a network. They're not randomly distributed. They cluster in major cities, but those cities are spaced at relatively regular intervals. Boston to New York, 216 miles. New York to Philadelphia, 95 miles. Philadelphia to Baltimore, 96 miles. Chicago to Milwaukee, 92 miles. San Francisco to Sacramento, 86 miles. Now, that might just be the natural distribution of cities, but then I looked at Russia. St. Petersburg to Moscow, 394 miles. Moscow to Kazan, 492 miles. Kazan to Yekaterinburg, 452 miles. The spacing is different but still remarkably regular. And if you draw lines connecting these cities, something interesting happens. They align with major telegraph routes from the 1800s. Now, telegraphs are real. We know they used wires. But what's interesting is that the first telegraph demonstrations didn't use wires. Claude Chapp's telegraph system, deployed in France starting in 1792, was entirely optical, towers with semaphore signals visible to the next tower. It worked, but it was slow and weather-dependent. Samuel Morse's electromagnetic telegraph, demonstrated in 1837, was revolutionary because it used wires. But Morse himself experimented with wireless transmission. His notes from 1842 describe attempts to send signals through the ground using metal stakes driven into the earth at distant points. It didn't work, or at least it didn't work well enough to replace wired telegraph. But what if there was already a network that could transmit power wirelessly, and early telegraph pioneers were trying to tap into it? I found something in the U.S. Patent Office archives that I can't explain. Patent number 48,061, granted to Moses G. Farmer on June 6, 1865. Improvement in telegraph lines. The patent describes a method of telegraph transmission using existing architectural structures as relay points, utilizing their elevated metallic elements to collect and retransmit signals without requiring continuous wire. The diagram shows church spires. Farmer was a legitimate inventor. He's credited with the first electric fire alarm system. This isn't a crank patent. It was granted by the U.S. government. But there's no record of it being built. No mention of it in Farmer's published work. The patent exists, but it's like it was filed and then forgotten. Why would you file a patent for a technology you never intend to build? Unless the technology already existed and the patent was an attempt to claim ownership of it. I started looking at other patents from this period. I found dozens of similar grants, systems for wireless telegraph using building spires, atmospheric electricity collection for lighting, resonant cavity amplification of electrical signals, all filed between 1850 and 1890, all describing variations of the same basic concept, using the existing architectural infrastructure, the spires, the copper, the underground chambers, everything.
It's like inventors were patenting components of a system that was hiding in plain sight. And then, between 1900 and 1920, both the patents and the architecture started disappearing. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, something that happened during a very specific period that nobody connects to this story: the World's Fairs. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago on May 1st, 1893. Over 27 million people visited over 6 months. It was the largest public gathering in American history to that point. And it was famous for one specific thing: the lights. The exposition had over 200,000 electric light bulbs, more than existed in the rest of the city combined. The Court of Honor was illuminated so brightly that visitors called it the White City because you could see it glowing from miles away at night. Nikola Tesla had an entire exhibit demonstrating wireless power transmission and phosphorescent lighting that required no wires. The official story is that all this electricity came from massive engines, specifically 12 giant Alice engines in the exposition's powerhouse. But here's what doesn't add up. I found the electrical engineering reports from the exposition, published in 1894. The generators had a combined capacity of 12,500 kilowatts. Sounds like a lot, but if you do the math, 200,000 bulbs, each drawing approximately 60 watts, plus motors, pumps, exhibit machinery, you need at least 12 million watts, 12,000 kilowatts. The numbers work, barely. But the reports note something odd. Actual fuel consumption approximately 40% below projected requirements. They burned less coal than expected for the power they generated. How do you generate the expected amount of electricity while consuming significantly less fuel? There's a note in the Electrical Engineer Journal from September 18, 1893. Visitors have noted that exposition lighting appears remarkably consistent regardless of time of day, weather conditions, or exhibition load variance. Engineering staff attributes this to superior generator regulation. Okay, but here's the thing. Those generators should have shown load variance. When you turn on more lights, generators have to work harder, burn more fuel, make more noise. That's basic thermodynamics. But multiple visitor accounts describe the generators as running smoothly and quietly, even during peak load. And there's another detail that nobody talks about: the buildings themselves. The exposition's main structures, the administration building, the manufacturers building, the electricity building, all featured elaborate spires and domes, copper-covered, connected to the building's internal frameworks. With deep basements, the architectural plans show basement levels going down 30 feet or more. These were temporary buildings. They were demolished in 1894, right after the fair closed. Why build such elaborate, expensive, permanent architectural features, the spires, the copper domes, the deep foundations, for buildings you're going to tear down in a year, unless those features were necessary for the exposition to function? The same pattern repeats at other World's Fairs. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, 1901, famous for its spectacular lighting, over 400,000 colored bulbs creating elaborate displays. The centerpiece was the Electric Tower, a 375-foot spire covered in lights with a copper-plated top. Demolished in 1902. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904, over 120 major buildings, all with elaborate spires and copper elements. Massive lighting displays that visitors said turned night into day. All demolished by 1905.
The Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, 1915. The Tower of Jewels, a 435-foot central spire covered in colored glass and lit by searchlights, surrounded by elaborate buildings with copper domes, all demolished by 1916. There's a pattern here. Build magnificent structures with elaborate metal spires, use them for massive public demonstrations of electrical technology, then immediately tear them down. The official explanation is that these were temporary exhibition buildings, not meant to last. But they weren't built like temporary buildings. The foundations were solid, the construction was high quality. Contemporary accounts describe them as palaces and monuments. You don't build monuments to tear them down a year later. Unless you're demonstrating something you don't want people to study too closely. I found a letter in the Chicago Historical Society archives dated October 19, 1893, from Daniel Burnham, the exposition's director of works, to an unknown recipient. It's cataloged as miscellaneous correspondence, and I only found it because I was going through uncatalogued boxes. The letter says, "The demonstration has exceeded expectations. The public has seen what is possible. Now the question becomes whether such possibilities should remain theoretical or become practical. I defer to your judgment on the disposition of the structures." What demonstration? The letter doesn't say, but it's dated 2 weeks before the exposition closed.
Burnham was writing to someone asking for guidance on what to do with the buildings. And whoever he was writing to decided, tear them down. All of them. I tried to trace who Burnham might have been corresponding with. His papers don't reveal it, but I did find records of a meeting in New York on November 3, 1893, 1 week after the exposition closed, attended by Burnham, Thomas Edison, J.P. Morgan, and several other industrialists. There's no official record of what was discussed, but within 2 years, Morgan had significantly increased his investments in copper mining and electrical utilities. Edison's company merged with Thomson-Houston to form General Electric, and the infrastructure for a wired, metered electrical grid was being rapidly deployed across American cities. At the same time, those magnificent exposition buildings, the ones that had lit up the night so spectacularly, were being systematically demolished. And the architectural features that made them special, the elaborate spires, the copper domes, were being removed from new construction or simplified beyond recognition. It's like someone decided the demonstration was over. Now, modern researchers will tell you I'm seeing patterns where none exist, that these are all coincidences, separate developments with separate explanations. Maybe they're right, but I keep coming back to one question. If these buildings were just decorative, why the urgent need to destroy them? Why not let them stand? Unless they were proof of something someone needed to erase. Let me tell you what happened when I tried to access the basement of the old City Hall in Philadelphia. I'm working on a documentary, this is part of it, so I contacted the city's Historical Commission in 2022. I explained I wanted to photograph the original basement structures from the 1870 building. I had all my equipment, insurance, the works. They said no. Not maybe later, not fill out more paperwork, just no. I asked why. The official reason, structural safety concerns. But here's the thing, the building is actively used. People work there every day. The ground floor is fine, the second floor is fine, but the basement, specifically the sub-basement level, the one shown on the original 1870 blueprints, is structurally unsafe and has been closed since 1978. I submitted a Freedom of Information request for inspection reports that would document these structural issues. The city said no such reports exist. So the basement is too dangerous to access, but there are no reports documenting why it's dangerous. I'm not the first person to run into this. There's a growing community of urban explorers and historical researchers who've documented similar stonewalling across multiple cities: Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, San Francisco, any building from the 1800s with significant basement levels, especially buildings that originally had elaborate spires, has restricted basement access. The usual explanation is asbestos, lead paint, structural concerns, liability. All legitimate reasons. But here's what's strange. Modern construction crews are specifically forbidden from accessing these spaces as well. I talked to a contractor who worked on the renovation of a historical church in Boston in 2019. He signed an NDA, so I can't use his name, but he showed me the work orders. The project involved upgrading the electrical systems and HVAC. The work orders had a specific clause: no excavation or structural modification below grade level. All subsurface work to be conducted by specialized heritage preservation contractors only. That's unusual. Normally, you want your electrical contractor to handle electrical work, but in this case, any work touching the basement level had to go through a separate company, one specifically approved by the city's historical commission. He found out why when he accidentally broke through a floor tile near the basement stairwell. Underneath wasn't concrete, it was brick, old brick, arranged in a very specific curved pattern, and beneath the brick was a ceramic lining. The specialized contractor showed up within 3 hours, cordoned off the area, and repaired it. They didn't just patch the floor. They removed all the broken tiles, excavated down several feet, and rebuilt the section exactly as it had been, for a floor tile. The contractor asked what was down there that required such precise restoration. The specialist said, historical preservation standards. That was it. No further explanation. Now, I started reaching out to these specialized heritage preservation contractors. Most won't talk, but I found one, recently retired, who was willing to speak off the record. He worked on subsurface restoration for historical buildings in multiple cities from 1995 to 2018. According to him, there's an informal protocol. When you access basement levels in pre-1900 buildings with certain architectural features, he specifically mentioned spires, copper domes, and vertical metal elements. You document what you find, restore it precisely, and you don't talk about it. I asked what they typically found. He said chambers, large brick chambers, sometimes with ceramic or marble lining, metal fixtures embedded in the floors and ceilings, shafts going up into the building structure above, and copper plates, big ones, buried deep below the basement floor.
I asked what these were for. He said, nobody ever told me, but they're clearly engineered. They're not storage, they're not foundations, they're something else. And whatever they are, we're supposed to keep them intact. He also mentioned something I found disturbing. During his career, he worked on 3 buildings where the city decided to permanently seal the lowest basement levels. They filled them with concrete, just poured it in until the chambers were completely inaccessible. Why would you permanently seal historical architecture? I asked him. He said the official reason was always structural stabilization, but he noted that in all 3 cases, the buildings didn't have structural problems. They were stable. They just had basements someone didn't want anyone accessing anymore. Now, you might think this is all circumstantial, and you'd be right. I don't have proof of a coordinated conspiracy to hide historical architecture. But I do have a pattern of restricted access, unusual preservation requirements, and deliberate destruction of subsurface structures. And it's not just in America. In 2021, researchers in St. Petersburg, Russia tried to access the sub-basement of the Kazan Cathedral, built from 1811 to 1858, with massive copper domes and a deep basement structure. The Russian Orthodox Church denied the request, citing sacred space preservation. But the Kazan Cathedral is a museum. It hasn't been an active church since 1991. There's no religious reason to restrict basement access. I found similar reports from researchers in London, Paris, Berlin, any city with significant pre-1900 architecture. Basement access is restricted, subsurface work is tightly controlled, and nobody will explain why. Meanwhile, there's a different pattern happening on the surface. Old buildings are being restored, which sounds great until you look at what's actually happening. The restoration involves removing or capping the metal elements on the roof. In 2015, the Philadelphia City Hall underwent a major restoration.
Part of the project involved stabilizing the tower by removing what the city called non-original metallic elements. These were copper rods and wire frameworks that had been part of the structure since 1881. The city called them deteriorated ornamental features. But photographs from before the restoration show they weren't deteriorated. They were intact. They were also connected. The photographs clearly show wire running from the roof elements down into the tower structure. After the restoration, those connections are gone. The tower now has purely decorative copper plating with no internal connection to anything. They didn't restore the building. They disabled it.
And this is happening everywhere. Chicago, Boston, San Francisco. Buildings that once had elaborate electrically conductive spires now have simplified decorative tops. The official explanation is always the same: preservation, safety, modernization. But they're systematically removing the functional elements while keeping the aesthetic ones. It's like someone is going through historical architecture and carefully dismantling anything that might still work. Now, here's the question I can't answer. Why? If these were just old architectural features with no function, why bother? Why spend millions on restoration projects specifically to remove metal elements? Why restrict basement access? Why seal chambers with concrete? Unless someone knows these features had a function and doesn't want anyone recreating it. I asked the retired contractor if he'd ever tried to research what the basement chambers were for. He said, "Once. I spent 3 months going through architectural journals, engineering papers, historical records. I couldn't find anything definitive. But I found something interesting. Multiple papers from the early 1900s recommending that subsurface electrical collection structures be decommissioned for public safety. Electrical collection structures. Not decorations, not foundations, electrical collection structures. And they were deliberately decommissioned. The question is, why? And more importantly, what were they collecting? So where does this leave us? I've shown you architectural features that don't match the official explanations. Patents for technology that was apparently never built, except the buildings that could have been that technology already existed. Massive fires that destroyed those buildings during the exact period when electrical utilities were being established. The removal of ether from physics at the exact moment when an ether-based power system would have become a threat to commercial electricity. Maps showing a massive territory that suddenly disappeared from geography. World's Fair demonstrations of electrical technology in buildings that were immediately demolished, and modern restrictions on accessing the subsurface structures of those same buildings. None of this is proof of anything. I want to be very clear about that. What I've presented are observations, questions, and correlations, not evidence of a grand conspiracy, not proof that there was a worldwide free energy system that was deliberately destroyed. There are reasonable, conventional explanations for every single thing I've mentioned. The fires could be coincidence. The architectural features could be purely aesthetic. The patents could be failed experiments. The basement restrictions could be legitimate safety concerns. The map changes could be standard geopolitical evolution. It's entirely possible that I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But here's what bothers me. The questions I've raised aren't new. Other researchers have asked them before. Some have asked them for decades. And those questions are never adequately answered. Instead, they're dismissed or ignored, or the people asking them are labeled conspiracy theorists. But dismissal isn't an answer, and the refusal to even engage with these questions, the refusal to allow access to historical structures, the removal of architectural elements during restoration, the absence of technical documentation about buildings that were obviously engineered for some purpose, that refusal itself is significant. Because if there's nothing to hide, why hide it? I don't know if Tartaria had a wireless power grid. I don't know if those spires collected atmospheric electricity. I don't know if there was a deliberate campaign to dismantle that technology. What I do know is that there are buildings all around us with features that don't match their supposed purpose, that there was a period in history when those features were systematically removed,
that modern authorities restrict access to those structures in ways that go beyond normal preservation protocols, and that nobody will explain why. Maybe there's a perfectly ordinary explanation that I'm missing. Maybe all of this is coincidence and overinterpretation. But maybe, just maybe, we're walking past the ruins of a technology we've forgotten how to see. So I'll leave you with this question. If you wanted to hide a worldwide infrastructure in plain sight, how would you do it? You'd call it decoration. You'd say it served no purpose. You'd restrict access to the parts that might reveal the truth. And you'd wait for everyone who remembered what it really was to die. Now, I can't tell you what's true. Nobody can. The evidence is incomplete, the records are missing, the people who built these structures are long gone. But I can tell you this. The questions are real. The architectural anomalies are real. The restrictions are real. And until someone provides better answers than, "It's just decoration," and "You can't access that space," those questions are going to keep being asked. So here's what I want from you. Look at the old buildings in your city. Really look at them. Notice the metal on top. Notice how deep the foundations go. Notice what's been removed during restoration. And ask yourself, what were these really for? Then come back here and tell me what you think. Because this isn't a mystery one person can solve. This requires all of us comparing notes, sharing observations, asking questions.
Hit subscribe if you want to see more of this investigation. Next week, I'm releasing footage from inside one of those restricted basements, footage that's never been made public before. And leave a comment. Do you think these buildings were part of a power grid? Do you have access to old structures in your area? Have you noticed these same architectural features? Because the only way we'll get answers is if enough people start asking the questions they can't ignore. What do you think? Decoration or infrastructure? The truth is probably somewhere we haven't even thought to look yet.